Psychoanalysis, self-psychology, Heinz Kohut. Self-psychology is a category by itself within the broad area of psychoanalysis. The founder of self-psychology was Heinz Kohut, and today we'll discuss about Kohut's concepts and Kohut's work. Kohut is not known popularly students who are in training at present, and even those who got trained after 2010, most of them would not have even heard of the word Heinz Kohut. Few of them would have heard of the word self-psychology and the name of Heinz Kohut, but don't have an understanding about what it all means. Few places of psychoanalysis teach Kohut, and these few are going fewer as time passes by. Unfortunately, Kohut is one of the very valuable thinkers, and his ideas are very valuable, and it would be a tragedy if we forget his ideas, don't use his ideas, don't develop his ideas, and don't integrate these ideas into whatever we are doing to enrich whatever we are practicing. Today's discussion will give an outline of self-psychology and Kohut. We will go into what is self-psychology, how did Kohut arrive at self-psychology, what are the core concepts of Cohesion thinking, what are the factors Kohut believes are determinants of pathology, how does Kohut view developmental process in childhood, what is the typology of personalities that Kohut has created, and how does cohesion therapy proceed? These are some of the important areas we will touch upon today. Deeper, if you wish to go, you can read some writers who introduce Kohut in an easy way and then go to Kohut himself, because Kohut is not easy to read. So start from someone who gives a concise outline of Kohut, go into commentaries on Kohut, and then finally get into Kohut and see if these concepts in application in your practice work out. Most important part is, if you are trained in classical psychoanalysis, this will look very different. It almost looks like it is not psychoanalysis at all, except for the fact that the frame is the same. However, on a deeper look, we realize that Kohut shares most of psychoanalytic concepts of the unconscious, of the frame, and departs from the classical psychoanalysis when it comes to the concept of the self, concept of self-pathology, and concept of doing therapy. However, you can't escape the feeling that self-psychology is radically different from classical psychoanalysis, although both of them are located, situated within the broad arcade of psychoanalysis. There also are points of no confluence between classical psychoanalysis and self-psychology. On these points of no confluence, they are radically apart. Very difficult to join them together. So let us go deeper into the subject today and slowly explore and understand the whole area of self-psychology and Heinz Kohut. Heinz Kohut was an American psychoanalyst. He was one of those who are dedicated to psychoanalysis, who think about psychoanalysis day in and day out and are completely absorbed in psychoanalysis. So much so that his contemporaries used to call him Mr. Psychoanalysis. Kohut himself underwent extensive psychoanalysis of his own. He underwent analysis twice, once with a Freudian analyst and once with a Kleinian analyst. Obviously, he had problems of his own, and neither of the two analyses could heal him. And then he had to explore on his own how to heal himself. And in that process, he discovered the fundamental principles of self-psychology. It's exactly like Freud. Just as Freud went through what he calls splendid isolation, and Jung went through what he calls nakia, Heinz Kohut also went through his own splendid isolation, his own nakia. And like Freud and Jung, in the process of healing himself, he discovered the fundamentals of self-psychology, and his journey he represents in a very famous paper, Analysis of Mr. Z. Is it Analysis of Mr. Z or Mr. Z? I'm getting confused. I think it is Analysis of Mr. Z, but just check it out. Developed his school called the Self-Psychology School. And this self-psychology school, of course, is a school within psychoanalysis. And therefore, the first point to note is that the self-psychology school and Heinz Kohut, they both accept the relevance of all existing schools and concepts in psychoanalysis. They accept the primacy of the unconscious, significance of the dreams, unconscious determination of pathology, primacy of childhood, primacy of free association, significance of dream analysis, the psychoanalytic frame of doing psychotherapy. On these concepts, there is no departure. There is no disagreement. Where it differs is self-psychology brings in an additional line of development. So during childhood, just as we have a linguistic line of development, a neurological line of development, a physiological line of development, a cognitive line of development, an affective line of development. Within the affective, the psychosexual line of development. Similarly, Kohut postulates, or in his words, discovers an additional line of development called the development of the self. So there is a line of self-development. Kohut, although is the father of self-psychology within psychoanalysis, and his whole entire work is based upon the concept of the self, he does not define clearly what is self. Kohut does not clearly define how self is, what it is and what it is not. Definitely, self is not the ego. Self is a much larger construct than the ego. So the self is a elusive concept in a way. It is almost like the concept of Dasein in Heidegger. As you use the concept in variety of contexts, you develop the meaning, you endow the word with meaning, and in a way you outgrow the need for a precise definition, at the same time recognizing the limitation that it imposes on you when you don't have a precise definition. So Kohut does not define the self, but to start with, you can very roughly say self is the sum total of the psychic personality. It's the closest word to self would be personality. Although they are worlds apart, but to start with, somewhere we have to start. So you can talk about the self as the sum total of everything in the psychological sense. So the psychological sum total of everything which you call self, let us start with from there, and slowly we will make it more clear, more crisp, more deeper. So Kohut says there is something called the self which is in development in the childhood. And this self is the fundamental unit of the psychic life. This self is much larger than the ego. It is not only the ego. At times, however, the way Kohut writes, self comes very close to ego. And at times, self goes away from ego. So Kohut says in self-psychology that there is something called the self, which is a very fundamental part of our psychic life, and it is under development in the childhood. And if the development goes fine, we develop a healthy self, and if the development does not go in a good way, we develop an unhealthy self. Now, what are the characteristics of healthy and unhealthy self? We'll take it up in the next slide. But for the moment, just be with these basics, that there is something called the self. This self is a very important element of our psychic life. This self can be loosely taken to be the sum total of the entire psychic apparatus that we have. Some people call it personality, some people call it an element within personality, separate from the ego, but larger than the ego. Just let the confusion be as it is at the moment. As we go deeper, it will clarify itself, and it will also come to a situation where we will have to develop our own definition of the self with help of concepts from Kohut, so that we become more clear, even if Kohut does not make an effort to make us more clear. So let us start with first, what is self-psychology about? Self-psychology is a school within psychoanalysis. Because it is within psychoanalysis, it accepts the fundamental principles of psychoanalysis. It accepts the validity of schools within psychoanalysis which pre-exist self-psychology. Self-psychology deals with the development of the self, and if the development goes on fine, the child develops a healthy self. If the development process in childhood does not proceed well, the child develops an unhealthy self. The child develops an unhealthy self. Because of this, if the child has pathology, we call that pathology self-pathology. So just as we use the word superego pathology, we use the word self-pathology. That there is a group of pathologies which are self-pathologies. Just as there is a group of superego pathology and there is a group of ego pathology, there is a group of self-pathology. And the idea there is that the self-formation is defective. And because the self-formation is defective, this defect is so fundamental that till this defect is not addressed, the application of other schools of psychoanalysis don't give results. And this is directly from self-experience of Kohut, that he had a self-pathology and no amount of Freudian or Kleinian analysis helped him. And therefore he says self-pathology is a distinct category of pathology. And unless this issue is addressed, no amount of application of other concepts of psychoanalysis helps the person to get well. And in self-psychology, there is an idea of self, there is idea of self-development, there is an idea therefore of the healthy and unhealthy self, and if an unhealthy self develops, the self-pathology develops. We will see in details what self-pathology is. And if self-pathology develops, then the way to heal it is not classical psychoanalytic psychotherapy, but so if self-pathology develops, then the way to heal it is not classical psychoanalytic psychotherapy, be it Freudian or Kleinian type, but the way to heal self-pathology is by practicing what Kohut calls his own way of psychotherapy, the Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And the Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy is radically different from classical way of doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy is based upon three very important concepts. There are more, we will take a look at it, but three to start with. Holding, providing holding to the person instead of just giving interpretations. Holding is to hold the person, just as a parent holds the child, the therapist in a psychological sense holds the person. The person who is disintegrating is held in a psychological sense by the therapist, just as a parent holds the child in a physical sense. Holding also means to hold back interpretations and wait for another time when the person is more ready for interpretation. Holding also means providing positive support so that the person is able to hold on to healthy parts of himself. And the person is able to hold on to coherent regulated states and does not fall down into unregulated, disintegrated, chaotic states. So holding is a very important element of Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So less of interpretation, more of support, more of positive experiences, mostly by omission. Second important element is empathy. Empathy is a very important element in the Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And empathy means not only providing empathy and support, but to go into the state the patient is and from there take a view 360 degrees. So empathy is not only goodness, nobility, support, positivity and stability that you provide without interpretation, but it is also a tool, a technical tool of exploring the patient, even while maintaining a distance enough so that you don't fuse with the patient. So it's an attunement without fusion and without anything that can be thought of as persecution or attack by the patient. And then the classical psychoanalytic psychotherapy is based upon the idea reflecting, not acting. But Kohut allows the person to live out in a concise way, in a psychoanalytic way, in a metaphorical way, and in small amounts, literally, the childhood fantasies, especially of grandiosity and self-object. We'll come to it later. But Kohut allows in small doses living out, mostly by taking the stance of omission. And this makes Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy very different from classical psychoanalytic psychotherapy, where we interpret grandiosity. We forbid living out even in small amounts. And we try to bring the person into reality from the fantasy of gratification. So these are some of the core characteristics of the self-psychology school. Then it is a school within psychoanalysis. It accepts all concepts and schools of psychoanalysis other than itself. Other than itself also. Self-psychology is based on the concept of self. It postulates a line of self-development. If self-development goes fine in childhood, we have a healthy self. If not, we have an unhealthy self. If we have an unhealthy self, it leads to self-pathology. And the way to heal self-pathology is not classical psychoanalytic psychotherapy, but Cohesion psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which has its own unique characteristics, three of which are holding, empathy, living out. More we will discuss as we go forward. So this brings us to how psychoanalysis as an area can be divided in terms of approaches. So within psychoanalysis, there are many schools, and all these schools can be grouped under these 5 categories. The drive frustration category, the Freudian school, and some of the post-Freudian schools will fall under the drive frustration category. The spelling is long, it is frustration, drive frustration. The idea here is that the pathology develops because a drive which wants to satisfy itself is held back by reality or superego. And that is where the frustration is, and therefore the pathology. Second school is the object relation school. The Kleinian school and schools created by followers of Klein, they are all object relations schools. Core belief there is that we are object seekers, and it is difficult object relations which create templates which lead to problems in adult life. So the most important element there for determination of pathology and healing of pathology is object relations, mostly of childhood. Then there is the independent school, which says it will take concepts from all other schools and not lead towards any of them. The fourth category of schools is a self-psychology school. And the self-psychology school and many schools which have emerged following Kohut and his followers, they get classified in the self-psychology category. And here the belief is that the core of pathology is development of something called the self, which we may not be able to define completely. In future we may do it, but there is something called the self, and there are phenomena we can clearly see related to the self. And in therapy, when we approach the healing of the self in a unique Cohesion way, we see results which we don't see from other schools. So self-psychology is based on the idea of the self, development of the self into healthy or unhealthy, and that unhealthy self leading to pathology. And this, Kohut says, is the most important element, that everyone does not have a split closed and everyone does not have the Oedipus resolved. And even then, people go on with their lives because the self is strong enough. That even though you have unresolved issues, the strong self puts a lid over those issues and you still lead a healthy life. But when the self becomes weak, fragile, and the lid is removed, the inherent unresolved problems they take over. So Kohut says it is more important to first develop a healthy self, and then we can go into the Freudian issues or Kleinian issues. Because in many cases, the moment a healthy self is developed, it won't be necessary at all to go into those issues. And if the healthy self is not developed, even if we go into those issues, we are not going to see a solution. The fifth category is of interpersonal schools, where the focus is on interpersonal here and now between the patient and the therapist for healing, and the interpersonal then and there, which would be responsible for creation of pathology. So self psychology is respected as a category by itself within psychoanalysis. Let us start with discussion of the self. Self is larger than the ego. Self is almost something that contains everything, and yet at times it appears as an agency other than the ego but greater than the ego, and at times it appears as the whole personality in the writings of Kohut. Whatever we can make out of it is this: one, the self acts as the coordinator in the sense of putting a lid over unresolved issues, providing a sense of identity, a sense of purpose to the person. So one, self is seen as the coordinator of the intrapsychic world. So this is a coordinator separate from the ego. Second, self is seen as the controller. Now in this sense, when we talk, it looks as though self almost appears as a second ego. But let us see slowly as we go along. Self as the coordinator, self as the controller of the inner world, and the self as powers and source of goodness. This is very important. This is where the self clearly is away from the ego. The self is the source of the goodness, of the energy, of motivation, of positivity, of cheerfulness. A healthy self is the source of all of this. And there it appears all as though these elements, the source, the goodness, the power, the energy, the motivation, the initiative, the creativity, all these elements come together and add to it the coordination function in some ways, and you have the self, which then appears as separate agency other than the ego. But at times it gets confused in Kohut. Let us just go on. Now this is the self. The self can be a coordinator, a controller, a power source of goodness. Let us keep the questions open. That self is definitely different from the ego. Is it something like the ego, a second agency in the mind? Or is it the sum total of everything, the personality? Or is the self and the ego two names we are using unknowingly, when in fact we should be using the name of personality ego for the self, and a intra-system ego for what we call the Freudian ego. I understand it that way, that that Kohut's self is more like a personality ego, and Freud's self is a part, your ego, you divided into two parts, the personality ego and the system ego. So if you divide into personality ego and the system ego, the personality ego then can be termed as a self, but Kohut does not say this, I say this, and I used Arbindo's concept there. Someday we will develop, discuss it, but Sri Aurobindo's concept of the ego is very near to Kohut's concept of the self. Let it be as it is. Let us not get into more complicated discussion. We are just beginning it. So just let us keep it simple. Self is seen as the coordinator, controller, and the power and source of goodness. For the moment, let us keep it as another agency other than the ego, and that will help us to simplify the discussion. Now, if self is an important element in the mind, then self-development must be happening in the childhood, or the self is inborn. If self is an important element of the psyche, the question arises, does the self come inborn, or is it created in the developmental process in childhood? Now, this is where the use of the word self is different in Kohut, Jung, and Winnicott. All the three people use the word self. Normally, we use the word myself, yourself in the colloquial way, but in the psychological way, the three people, Carl Jung, Winnicott, and Kohut, they all three use the word self in very different ways because all of them are using it as a technical term in psychoanalysis. So let us look at how the three are different. Jung's self is inborn. It is the coordinator of the psyche, in the center of the psyche and at times around the psyche, and it coordinates the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and through that coordinates the program of life. Jung's self is structural, it is inborn. It is the supreme power that coordinates the program of life by activating and deactivating archetypes age appropriate to the person. Jung stops short of going into philosophy. He stops at metapsychology with the concept of the self. He does not try to link the self of the individual with any supreme power like Hegel does, where Hegel links the self of the individual to the absolute. Jung stops short of that. In Sri Aurobindo's writings, it's different. The self, Sri Aurobindo does not use the word self, but he uses another entity called the psychic, is linked to the absolute, but in the absolute it does not dissolve completely. It comes with a unique individuality called the central being. But let us come back to psychoanalysis. Let me not divert too much. So the three people for Jung, so let us look at what Jung, Kohut, and Winnicott say about the word self, how they use it differently. For Jung, the self is structural, inborn, supreme. It is a coordinator and regulator for the program of life by activation and deactivation of age-appropriate archetypes. For Winnicott, self is phenomenological. It's not inborn. Self is created, and he uses the two words, true self and the false self. True self is our authentic self, and false self is what we create and put up in the front to deal with the world. Kohut uses the word self neither in the sense Jung uses it nor in the sense Winnicott uses it. The self of Kohut is very different. One, it is not structural. It is not inborn, but it is structural. So like Jung, it is not inborn, but like Winnicott, it is not just a front, right? It is not just a self-image and authentic self-image, a public image and authentic image, or something in front and something below. Rather, it is far more of a structural entity than Winnicott uses in his theorization. So Kohut's self is far more structural than Winnicott's self, but Kohut's self is not inborn like Jung's self. So with Jung, he shares the structural component of the self, but Jung's self is inborn, Kohut's self is not inborn, and Kohut's self, like Winnicott's self, develops in childhood or in the phenomenological process, but Kohut's self has nothing to do with ideas of collective unconscious archetypes or the program of life. So Kohut's self is different from Jung's self and Winnicott's self. Kohut's self is a structural entity created phenomenologically. Once created, becomes a structural entity. And we will see what are the important elements which lead to development of healthy or unhealthy self. But before we go there, let us look at self-development and say self-development happens in childhood, and if it happens well, we have a healthy self. If it does not happen well, we have an unhealthy self. If we have a healthy self, the characteristic of healthy self are: the healthy self is realistic, it is normal, it is relating to others, it is productive, it is initiative taking, creative and playful. These are the characteristics of a healthy self. Obviously, healthy self is a continuum and the unhealthy self also is a continuum, and we find ourselves on some continuum at some point. Unhealthy self. If self-development does not happen well in childhood, we develop an unhealthy self. There are three types of unhealthy self that Kohut talks about in details. Followers of Kohut have expanded this concept of unhealthy self to create more categories, but let us start with what Kohut said elaborately. The most unhealthy form of self, the most unhealthy self is the psychotic self. The psychotic self has ego cohesion very low, and the frequency of disintegration is very high. So cohesion of the ego and the cohesion of the self and the disintegration of the self are very important element in Kohut. Kohut says much of self pathology has to do with the disintegration of the self. I should not be using the word ego here. I should be using the word self. Self, self, self. It's a mistake. It will lead to ego cohesion. It will lead exactly to what is written here. But we can start by using the word self and then slowly get into nuances. So this is not wrong what is written there, but you can use the word self here if you wish to. That will make it simpler to understand. But this is also fine if you want to use it this way. It's not wrong. So if you have an unhealthy self, you can have three kinds of unhealthy self: psychotic, borderline, narcissistic. This is most unhealthy. This is less unhealthy than psychotic. This is least unhealthy of the three. And number 4, if you put, it would be a normal self, a healthy self. The most healthy of all the 4. Now in psychotic self, ego cohesion is low and the frequency of disintegration is very high. Which means even without stress much stress from outside or inside, the psychotic self by itself can disintegrate. And the frequency is very high, say a few times in a week, or in extreme cases, maybe even a few times a day. Borderline self is more healthy compared to psychotic self, less healthy compared to narcissistic self. Ego cohesion is low, disintegration frequency is moderate. Narcissistic self has better health than the other two, but less health than the normal self. Ego cohesion is moderate and frequency of disintegration is low. Usually it happens only under stressful situations. So the self-development process will lead in childhood to the formation of a healthy self or unhealthy self. Unhealthy self can take 3 forms: psychotic, borderline, narcissistic, and Kohut puts them on a continuum. Narcissistic self, borderline self, psychotic self, and one can move on this continuum in therapy as one gets more healthy, or one can move in the opposite direction as the sickness deteriorates. We should also mention here that Kohut also talks about healthy narcissism, and Kohut believes narcissism as a developmental stage is universal, just as Mahler believes that autism as a developmental stage is universal. Self-pathology, Kohut says, is different from other pathology. So it is a distinct category of pathology, and it is so fundamental that in many cases, unless you solve this, application of other schools does not lead to resolution of pathology. And Kohut sees essentially self-pathology as an arrest of development. He says we are passing through a developmental process where universally we have to pass through the process of narcissism, of grandiosity, of exhibitionism, and we expect that we will have good objects around us who will accept us, acknowledge us, admire us. And if it does not happen, we develop intense feelings of inferiority and shame, and we get fixated in that transitory developmental stage of narcissism. And if we had good surroundings, we would have graduated out of it naturally. So Kohut says there is a phase of narcissism and exhibitionism, anticipating acceptance and admiration in everyone's life. And if everything around us is good, we just pass through it and we move from a narcissistic self to a realistic self, healthy self naturally. If the developmental process is not good, this natural movement is arrested and we get fixated in the narcissistic self with intense feelings of inferiority and shame, to defend against which we create grandiosity and self-sufficiency and entitlement to fame. And at times, it's not even necessary to create it. We can just get fixated in those early life infantile feelings. Self-pathology in Kohut's view cannot be healed by classical psychoanalysis, which focuses on reality acceptance, giving up some forms of gratification, and the tool of interpretation. So what does Kohut say? Kohut says self-development is a distinct line of development. And how the self develops? It develops with real life experiences and constitutional factors both, but Kohut gives more importance to real life experiences rather than constitutional factors. So he is more on the side of Winnicott and less on the side of client when it comes to relative significance of real life experience versus constitutional factors. He is more on the side of real life experiences. Kohut also talks about caregivers rather than in specific about mother or father or society. So unlike Winnicott, who focuses more on the mother, unlike Klein and Freud, who also focus more on the mother, Kohut focuses more on caregivers rather than specifically the mother or father or society. Kohut also does not go about into details of part object or full object relationships. That is how the self psychology differs from other schools. Let us now look at what factors affect this line of development of the self. When we say a healthy self develops, when does it develop? When we say unhealthy self develops, when does it develop? What are the factors and phenomena in early childhood that are responsible for development of healthy or unhealthy self? Kohut lists out 7 distinct phenomena or elements which are responsible for development of the self. If all the 7 work out well, or majority of them work out well in early childhood, we develop a healthy self. If most of them or don't work out well, or few of them are very difficult in experience, we develop an unhealthy self. Let us understand the 7 core factors responsible for development of a healthy self. First, Kohut says mirroring. He says we have an inborn tendency of experiencing omnipotence and narcissism and exhibiting our competencies and ourselves to our caregivers, and we expect acceptance and admiration from them. We expect them to see, acknowledge and admire our exhibitionism, our narcissism. We don't want interpretation at that time. We want acceptance and admiration. And if the world mirrors our beliefs about ourselves, we say mirroring is happening fine. What are the 5 elements of mirroring? We'll go into details in a moment from now. If mirroring does not happen, if acknowledgement does not happen, admiration does not happen, acceptance does not happen, we develop an intense feeling of inferiority and shame. We believe we are very good, we exhibit ourselves, but the world doesn't say we are very good. So either the world doesn't say keep silence, or the world criticizes. In either case, we come back, we go out to exhibit ourselves expecting admiration and acceptance. If it does not happen, we come back rejected and ashamed. Inferiority and shame develop intensely, and we are not able to move forward. We get fixated at that stage, and we are fixated there, get fixated therefore in that false self of grandiosity and self-sufficiency, even as intense shame and inferiority are below those things. Second, Kohut says, is idealization. That children need to see ideals in caregivers around them, and the children sort of go into these people, take those ideals and implant ideals into them. Of course, it's a metaphorical description, it's not a literal description. So children partake of ideals. It's almost like children take ideals and internalize them. Why these ideals are so necessary to be seen in people around, we'll discuss in the next slide. But idealization is a very important phenomena that caregivers around the child should be good enough that the child can idealize them, see the ideals in them, project one's ideals in them, and from them learn that it is right to have these ideals, that it is right to work hard and pay a price for these ideals. And these ideals are those poles which are poles of stability of the person. The person will not move away from these ideals. These ideals provide stability, reliability, and respect for the person, and these ideals are then internalized by the child, and that creates a pole of ideals, stability, reliability, fortitude, and readiness to pay price and work hard for something. This is a very important element in child's personality. The stable fortress of beliefs, of certitudes. Third is self-object experiences. Okay, so idealization, if it does not go well, again unhealthy self develops. Third is self-object experiences. Kohut says there are three kind of experiences we have: experience of ourself, experience of interacting with the other who has a mind, desire, and autonomy of his own, and we cannot expect the other to behave always as we want him to behave. That is the experience with the other, the object. So there is an experience with the self. So elements inside of us, in the psychological sense, in the conscious sense, are aligned to our desires. The object has desire of his own, but there is in between the two. There are some people who are different from us. Obviously, they are people in their own way, but they behave in a way so as to satisfy a maximum of our desires. These people who don't exercise much mind, desire, and freedom of their own and behave as though they are extensions of us, they behave in a way to please us, at times obey us. These objects which predominantly act more in our interest than in their interest are what Kohut calls self-objects. That these are objects other than us, other than the self, but they are not ordinary objects. These are objects which predominantly work according to our desire. So these are not completely distinct from ourselves. It almost is as though they are extensions of ourselves, and these objects are called self-objects, and experiences with these objects are called self-object experiences. Kohut says, in childhood, we all want self-object experiences. And if we don't get, then in adult life, we are in search of people who would predominantly do as we wish them to do, and who would prioritize us over them. We are in search of such self-objects. In fact, all of us are in search of self-objects. Very few of us would be satisfied enough in childhood not to search for self-object in adult life. Much of difficulties in relationships are because we want the other object not to be an object but to be a self-object. In the quotient sense, of course. If the child gets adequate self-object experiences, he moves towards healthy self. Fourth is empathy. If caregivers provide empathy, support, and are not overly critical, we move towards a healthy self. Overcritical surroundings, we move towards an unhealthy self. Because every time there is a criticism, it is an assault on the cohesion of the ego. And the fragile ego breaks, it never gets a chance to really solidify. It's like you put together things by applying an adhesive, but the adhesive does not get adequate time to solidify. And we have fault lines then in the ego. Then Kohut talks about the phenomena of alter ego. That some people can be so that they complement us. They are our alter ego. And some people are such who are so devoted to us that in our absence, they would speak what we would have spoken if we were present. So those who complement us and those who are exactly like us, who can take our place, both of them can be referred to in different contexts as alter egos. And we need alter ego experiences. Similarly, the experiences of twinship, which is less fused than self-object experiences. Self-object experiences are very fused experiences. Slightly less fused are twinship experiences, where we are with a friend and we experience a closeness which is more than that of an ordinary friend in real life. It's a twinship experience. Both alter ego and twinship experiences are necessary. If they are deficient, often we find them compensated in the dreams. 7th, Kohut talks about impingement. If there is too much of intrusion into the child as he is playing, Winnicott would call it going on deep. Too much of intrusion can also lead to unhealthy self-formation. So these 7, if they all go well, we have a healthy self. If majority of them go well, we still have a healthy self. If on the other hand, most of them go wrong, we have an unhealthy self. If a few of them go radically wrong, again we can have a partially unhealthy self, and then all the combinations in between. Simplified, to summarize, it says, if these 7 go well, we have a healthy self. If these 7 don't go well, we have an unhealthy self. And depending on how much they go well, we have how healthy self we have. And depending on how not well they go, we have how unhealthy self we will develop. And obviously, based upon what goes wrong, the pathology develop, the flavor of unhealthy self develop will give an idea about what has gone wrong. For example, if mirroring has gone wrong and we develop an unhealthy self, it is more likely to be a mirror hungry personality. And therapy of that will be slightly differently flavored than therapy of somebody where the core problem is deficiency of self-object experiences. So therapy gets tailored based upon which of the 7 is the real difficulty. Let us go into details of 2 important parts of that 7 elements necessary for development of a healthy self. First is mirroring. The 5 A's: acknowledgement, attention, acceptance, affection, admiration. Good mirroring means early in childhood, when we have the sense of omnipotence, the sense of narcissism, and we go out to exhibit ourselves in search of these 5 elements. Our needs are in early childhood, we should be acknowledged, we should be given attention to, we should be accepted, we should be provided affection, and we should be provided admiration from caregivers around us. If mirroring happens fine, we don't develop a mirroring based unhealthy self. The second is, if mirroring doesn't go fine, we may develop a mirror hungry personality or some form of unhealthy self where the core problem is related to each of these, any of these five. Mirroring problem essentially are problems of confidence. They are problems of I am good enough, I am not good enough. And they are problems of recognition. Second is idealization. Idealization is very necessary because it leads to, first is self-assurance that there is something solid to believe in, that there are some ideals and there is something solid to believe in, it's not all flux. Then the person is believing in it and is ready to pay a price. So there is something to believe in, and that is stable, it is reliable, the person is reliable, that the person will stick to these things. And then there are ideals and goals, that these ideals the person stands by, which are reliable, stable, and we can feel self-assured that the person will stand by them. These are indeed ideals and goals worth having and internalizing in oneself. And it is necessary, not only necessary, but it is good to have sincerity and fortitude related to these ideals and goals. And we see sincerity and fortitude in people around us related to these ideals and goals, and we develop it ourselves. Goals have to come out of ideals. We develop the superego strength which help us to reach the goals when the goals are related to our ideals. Kohut developed a typology of personality. And Kohut divides people into 5 categories. The mirror hungry personalities. And of course, he does it from a pathological standpoint. Mirror hungry personalities, ideal hungry, alter ego personalities, merger hungry, and contextually. Like Jung, Kohut developed a typology. And we can see what has gone wrong by the very name of the person. So when a person comes to Kohut and Kohut starts to investigate what is the self-pathology the person is suffering from and what is the type of person he is, the typology becomes useful. Mirror-hungry personalities are those where the unhealthy self is developed in a way that deficiency in childhood mirroring is the core problem, and in therapy they essentially seek mirroring. Ideal hungry personalities are those who want to see people with ideals around them but cannot see, have not seen in early childhood. They want to see people with ideals so that they can believe in the ideals and internalize those ideals. These are ideal hungry personalities. Alter ego personalities are those who are in search of alter ego friends, alter ego colleagues, and they seek in the therapist an alter ego. Merger hungry personalities are those who want to fuse and merge. They essentially are self-object experience seeking personalities. Either I become your self-object or you become my self-object. It cannot be object-to-object relationship. It has to be self-object relationship. Either I become the self-object or you become the self-object. Contact-shunning personalities are those who fear human contact because they fear attack and persecution. This is the most fragile of the categories, and they find it difficult first to come to therapy and then to get close to the therapist. How does cohesion therapy work? Kohut talks about holding, and holding means holding back interpretation. Interpretation can be seen as an attack, as something which disintegrates the person, and so initially hold back interpretations, hold back discussion of difficult things, hold back pointing out some deficit or defect if you see, and provide a scaffolding to the person, a, a healthy scaffolding, a healthy holding to the person. You psychologically hold the person just as physically a parent holds a small infant. Holding may also mean rounding off edges of self-attack of the person. Second, when the person is living out his grandiosity, unlike in classical psychoanalysis, classical psychoanalysis does not go into holding in a Puritan sense, although now holding has become inseparable part of psychoanalysis in all the schools, and that is where Kohut has actually infiltrated into all the schools without most schools realizing that they are practicing a cohesion concept, a cohesion technique. Most therapists today, regardless of the school, they start off with holding and slowly increase the intensity of interpretation. And that's a very cohesion way of doing it. Mostly without crediting Kohut. Second important element of cohesion therapy is allowing the patient to live out the grandiosity by not interpreting it. By an act of omission, we allow gratification. Kohut says interpretation of grandiosity actually creates more inferiority and shame in the person, and whatever inferiority and shame in the person already are there in the unconscious, they get even more repressed and deeper. If you allow grandiosity to be lived out in the therapy room, soon the person moves by himself naturally from grandiosity, a narcissistic self, to a realistic normal self. This allowing of living out over an extended period of time by an act of omission is a distinct cohesion technique. Third is allowing the person self-object experiences. The person often wants the therapist to become like a behave like a self-object, and the therapist does it by acts of omission, and rarely by acts of commission. And you allow the person to live out the self-object experience need just as you allow the person to live out the grandiosity. This is a very distinct cohesion technique. Dream analysis uses cohesion concepts like mirroring, idealization, impingement, alter ego, twinship, and very importantly, whether the dream is talking about disintegration or cohesion. So these are the concepts which are used in cohesion dream analysis, which are very different from the concepts used by other schools. So the same dream interpreted by cohesion technique gives a very different interpretation than the same dream interpreted by a Freudian or a Kleinian technique. For Kohut, the continuum of shame to fame is very important continuum. Social psychology has realized that shame is almost like a master social emotion. that in all social situations, shame is one of the most common affects which is evoked. And we have this continuum of shame to fame. And this continuum and the movement on this continuum is very important for Kohut. The idea is to be in the optimum zone on the shame fame continuum and to move towards fame so far as possible, and to see if in the past we have been into shame and how much shame is unprocessed in us. So analysis of shame in different situations is very important element in cohesion therapy. It's almost like what guilt is to client, shame is to Kohut. Movement is from a narcissistic self to a healthy self. And classical interpretations that are used in psychoanalysis are used in the cohesion therapy only after a long period of the person healing parts of himself and getting ready. The self becomes healthy enough to benefit now from classical interpretations. So they are deployed at last. Kohut uses a very important term called transmuting internalization. It says you internalize something from outside and it changes inside so much that the outside then is not needed. For example, if a good object is to be internalized, and in therapy I internalize a good object, after some time it becomes a part of me and I don't require physically the good object outside, it is now inside of me. And that good object now being inside of me changes the whole psychic situation completely, and that changes it forever. Therefore it is a transmutation of the psyche for good through an internalization, and this Kohut calls transmutating internalization. That transmutation happens because of an internalization. And this in Kohut's language, Kohut's conceptual thinking is very important. That the phenomena of transmuting internalization is one of the core elements in therapy and also in early life. And because in a healthy way, transmuting internalizations have not happened, that deficits are getting created, along with other factors, of course. What are the factors responsible for allowing or not allowing transmuting internalization? That is a deeper subject. Some other day we will discuss. Followers of Kohut have developed cohesion technique, and some of them create experiences which were not experienced in childhood. For example, if somebody needs self-object experiences, some people go out of their way and create those, where we bring in an element of psychodrama into psychoanalysis. Some have gone to the extreme of joining in, particularly in dealing with teenagers, where the therapist joins in with the teenager as a partner in crime on the surface, so that the teenager is with the therapist and does not eject out of therapy or does not get into fighting with the therapist, opens up to the therapist, becomes a gets into a alter ego or twinship relationship with the therapist, and then opens up oneself to the change and to the interpretations or the suggestions the therapist makes. So for teenagers or children, the joining in technique where the therapist becomes a partner in crime on the surface or the confidant on the surface and keeps working in a subtle way to change the client. Both these things have been done in a measured way and in a radical way, and the radical forms of both of them are something which is almost like a blasphemy for classical psychoanalysis. Kohut has been unknowingly incorporated in psychoanalysis. His concepts of holding, of empathy, transmuting, internalization, they are all now more and more in the center of most of psychoanalytic schools, even though they may not know what it is. Kohut describes, I mean, most of them don't know these are cohesion concepts, they don't credit Kohut, but like Freud has spread out to many areas who have not heard of Freud or who don't credit Freud, same for Kohut in the area of psychoanalysis. Kohut also talks about some additional concepts of the arc of tension. So Kohut says there is on one hand competencies and motivations, competencies and ambitions, and on the other hand you have goals and ideals, and there is a tension between the two, and he calls it the arc of tension, and there should be a healthy arc of tension in the individual. Sartre said the other is the hell. Kohut says the other is the sunshine, and of course he refers to the good other. Just the presence of the good other creates a sense of security, well-being, motivation, energy, productivity, positivity, creativity, and a joy in the world in us. So, Kohut sees the good other as a psychological elixir for psychological health. If I have missed some concept, read my chapter on Kohut in my book FAQ Psychoanalysis. It is available on Kindle, also on Amazon.com. Read Ernest Jones and a few other good Kohutians who have developed Cohesion ideas, and do develop a perspective in Kohut. We can't develop expertise on every school of psychoanalysis. So we have to develop expertise in one and perspective of many to be able to have a basket full of tools, because different clients need different concepts for pathogenesis, for correct pathogenesis, and different tools for technique of therapy. So don't miss Kohut. He is a very important thinker, not adequately thought of as important, not adequately respected, adequately given credit to, now almost on the verge of being forgotten. But it is tragic the way things are, the way it is. There are very valuable concepts and techniques in the Cohesion school, and if you apply that in practice, many times you find what Kohut says is correct, and therefore we have to incorporate and enrich psychoanalysis with incorporating Cohesion concepts and technique. Questions, if any, write to hvindia@gmail.com. Thank you.